Okay, let's talk a little bit about performance enhancing drugs. It's chapter 16 in your book. What's interesting about this is there's obviously a huge sense of controversy around it. A lot of people think certain things shouldn't be banned or that certain things should be banned that aren't banned. Um, a lot of people come at the argument and say, well, if everybody's doing it and only certain people are getting caught, that's not fair either because you have all these people out there and people feel like they have to do it to be able to compete and to be able to be at that same level. And then only, one out of how many are actually getting caught. And so people are still doing it. Um, Bottom line is the idea is, you know, it's harmful. People have died. Um, and and ideally, we want competition to be fair. But in regards to specifics, going back in history, it just talks a little bit like the Greeks using some mushrooms and things like that. It talks about Aztecs using the peyote and things like that. And then early on, there were stimulants that they talk about, three main ones. Strychnine, which is interesting because that actually, we now know that as rat poison. But they were using that as a stimulant in low doses. But if you notice when you read, there was actually an Olympian that collapsed and they had to revive him because he had had a mixture of that and I think it was brandy. Yeah, brandy in there. And then obviously cocaine. Cocaine was another stimulant that um, they looked at. They talk about someone from the cycling team. Um, and then you talk about caffeine. And caffeine is something we still talk about today because it's a little bit controversial because, again, most people have caffeine every day. It's really the amount and in like what format you're taking it in. So those are some of the things that they've seen, in the past. And as far as caffeine, and usually they're talking about people taking caffeine tablets, and it's kind of like across the board. They mention boxers, runners, swimmers, cyclists, um, other athletes, things like that. The problem with the stimulants, and one of the reasons we have to be very careful about even caffeine, is it's a stimulant. It increases your heart rate. Well, what does exercising do? It increases your heart rate. And some of them also can cause issues with you being able to cool down properly. So you're increasing your heart rate, your body temperature is going up. And if you're not able to um, sweat enough or whatever it is to bring your body temperature down, that's when it causes real issues. And then, like I said in here too, another issue is going to be, are you mixing it with anything? And that can cause detrimental effects. Very interesting little box you guys had to read talks about what are we going to do with marijuana in regards to performance enhancing, um, because there are states now that it's legal recreationally and they have professional sports teams or their college sports teams or whatever it is. It's technically legal in that state, but it's still considered a banned substance. So players right now are still getting in trouble. College athletes could get kicked off their team. Is that something where we have to now adjust the banned policies and allow those substances, or is it going to be, that's just going to be how it is? And even though it's legal in that state, when you play a sport, you're going to be held to a different standard, and you can still be fined or penalized for having those substances. Um, for amphetamines, not really sure when they really started using them, but it does mention again, like we've kind of talked about before, a lot of these things started to happen in regards to war. So it says a lot of, we saw an increase of amphetamines during World War II, which we had kind of mentioned when we talked about amphetamines. But basically, when we started doing testing, there's international drug testing, and one of the big sports that they really started to focus on was cycling. People have gotten very uh, creative when it comes to trying to enhance their cycling performance. We know of people who will actually do like transfusions, blood transfusions and stuff, on their night of rest or whatever it is, to make sure they have, you know, better things in their system. Um, it's kind of crazy the lengths that some cyclers are going to, but that was one of the, I think, the big things that they focused on. And they're testing more and more now, especially in regards to that. As far as football, you guys have seen a lot of, that's something that's kind of more out there in the media. So you guys see a lot of those situations. There was the Green Bay Packer that got suspended this year, and others. He just pops into my mind, but you guys have started to see players get suspended quite a bit more for things, for failing drug tests. And a lot of times those are not even necessarily what we consider performance enhancing drugs. They're just banned substances or illegal drugs. So it's going to be something like marijuana, or it's going to be something like, a lot of times it's marijuana, but maybe something like cocaine or something like that. When we get into the actual performance enhancing, this is where most people relate steroids, and we talk about steroids. Everything else, there's some reason that it's banned in regards to sports. So if you talk about like marijuana, a lot of people think marijuana is performance enhancing, not because it necessarily makes you run faster or jump higher, but because maybe it calms people's nerves, and so they're not as nervous, or maybe people say they're more focused, or they're less anxious, so they're able to perform at a better level because they're not nervous. Things like that, or something like we said with caffeine or cocaine or any of those things. Obviously, those things are going to speed you up, so those people are going to feel more energized and things like that. But when we talk about performance enhancing drugs, a lot of people just relate it to steroids. So when you talk about steroids, you have what are called anabolic steroids that basically promotes metabolism. It promotes building tissues. So one of the things that we talk about with performance enhancing steroids is it's not always about, again, making you run faster or jump higher. It might be something like you've had an injury, or you're sore, or your muscles are tired, and then you take these substances and it helps regenerate your muscles better. It helps you heal faster, something like that. So even though it might not be giving you, bigger muscles or something like that, it's giving you an edge because someone else who is maybe feeling sore as well, or maybe has the same injury, it's going to take them a lot longer to recuperate, or they might not recover as well, because they're not taking that substance. Hopefully you've all heard of the Balco scandal, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but just remember, obviously that was focused pretty much on Major League Baseball. That's where you heard about it. There were a lot of athletes involved, but obviously Barry Bonds was the big name that we talk about with Balco. And basically it took them a while, but they ended up taking down this whole company, and then the company had to release names of everybody that they had been clients, and taking different substances from them. Again, there's a lot of controversy on the testing. We think, drug use is becoming more and more prevalent, not just in athletes, but in everyone, or not in everyone, but like when you talk about things like marijuana stuff that are getting legalized, and there's this whole issue. We feel like athletes are starting to take drugs more often, but we also have to think like it's expensive to test athletes, and especially if you think like in a professional organization, okay, maybe they have the money and it's not a big deal and they could test before every game or whatever. But if you think about an NBA team, they play a ridiculous amount of games. Baseball plays a ridiculous amount of games. Are you going to test before every game? And if you are, think about the cost of that and where is that money going to come from? And then when you break it down into the college level, it's even worse because now you're talking about a mostly public institutions. And if they're testing every athlete before every competition, it's ridiculous. It's expensive. It takes time. And then how do you choose? And, we do random, they try to do random drug tests. But the bottom line is a lot of times certain sports kind of get pigeonholed and they say, well, this sport, we see a higher trend, so we want to test them more. And then you start to get into, legal issues because is one sport being tested more than another? All kinds of stuff. So there's a lot of debate out there about, do we ban these substances? If we ban them, how often do we test for them? Not really a good answer for that, but it's an interesting thing to kind of investigate and see, what some of the statistics say. Let's see. I just want to mention ephedra because that's one of the big stimulants that you guys have read about, and again, was something that was used pretty frequently for a while. It's an herbal source of ephedrine, and I think we had even mentioned it back then that it was being used as a performance-enhancing substance. But basically what it does, it relaxes bronchial passages. So a lot of people have medicine have these, or who have asthma have these as medicine, or have this as medicine. Most people weren't concerned with it in the beginning because if you think about it, people who take that for asthma, there's not any really crazy, it's not like they're all of a sudden great athletes or this or that or whatever. But basically, the more that they saw it, if you remember, and I think we mentioned this before, there was a Baltimore Orioles pitcher, Steve Beckler, and he died during practice because he was taking that, and he ended up having a stroke because he had a bunch of this in his system. And then, like I said, it was one of those things where his body couldn't process it properly. I think he got overheated and couldn't cool down, but he ended up having a stroke. So obviously, as they started to see more cases like that, that is a substance that got banned very quickly. Again, just a little bit more about steroids. Just remember, androgenic are masculizing. So, a lot of times we talk about people taking extra testosterone or things like that. There's not, a lot of times these are called anabolic steroids, but they don't really have a masculizing effect. So that's something to keep in mind. Let's see. In 1992, they did kind of come up, it was a physician's desk reference, which basically said that anabolic steroids have not been shown to enhance athletic ability. But that was like a disclaimer that they had to have, and now they don't even require that by the FDA. The thing about testosterone is obviously it's going to have an effect on muscle mass and strength, especially during puberty. But I guess what they're trying to figure out is adding it to what you already have, how much of a difference is that going to make? You got to think about, for women, obviously it's different, but if you're talking about males, they already have a significant amount of testosterone for the most part. So what is adding a little bit more going to do for them? Is it really going to increase their muscle mass that much more? Is it really going to increase their strength that much more? So those are some of the considerations that we have to think about. Psychological, everybody's heard about roid rage, so that's something that we talk about. Again, I think it's maybe overestimated a little bit, but there are definite mood changes that result from really almost any drug use. So steroids is no different. And the thing that we just want to be careful about is when we started talking about roid rage, a lot of people started to try to tie different violent acts to roid rage, and we want to be careful not to do that unless there's actual proof of that. But there is definite mood shifts, things like that. When you talk about effects on your body, like we said, it's going to depend on what you're using. But when you're talking about the steroids that we're talking about right now, especially if you use them too young, it's going to affect the way that your body develops. You might not develop fully. There can be problems with your liver, blood cysts in your liver, heart disease, high blood pressure, like some outside stuff that we've always talked about, acne, baldness, atrophy of the testes for men, breast enlargement for men. Women are going to have a little bit different, but when we add in the steroids or testosterone or whatever, there's going to be more dramatic effects because, like we said, women have testosterone, but it's at a much lower level. So they are going to experience quite a bit of growth, muscle growth, masculinization, which then is going to, you're going to see acne. The breasts are going to get smaller, fluid retention, even enlargement of the clitoris. Facial hair, deepening of voice, again. And the interesting thing is some of the things are going to be reversible, some of them are not going to be reversible. So like it's like once the damage is done, it's going to be permanent. Human growth hormone, again, that's another one we talk about, which we have, it's in our body. But the idea is when we take it, if it's a small child, it's going to help them grow, become taller, more muscular. Into adults more, we look at it in regards to maybe trying to help them recover, again, recover from an injury or something like that. Creatine, I just want to mention because that was huge for a while. People still take it now, but there was a big phase of creatine. And basically the idea is that's part of what is part of our ATP system that gives us energy. So taking creatine is supposed to help in that process of giving us energy. And that's really about it for performance enhancing drugs.